Dr. Dorman, thank you very much. That's a very generous introduction. I'd also like to make a brief comment about Chris Ruddy, who is a very good friend of mine, a very brave man. He has told me about 2 occasions on which... Can you hear me now? Did you hear any of that? Or would you like me to say it all over again? You want me to say it again? Right. First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Dorman very much for his over-generous introduction. Secondly, I'd just like to make a few remarks about Christopher Ruddy, who is a personal friend of mine. He has told me on 2 occasions about attempts on his life, one involving the insertion of a substance in a sausage. Now, I'm not at liberty to go into detail on this, except that I can say that I have evidence of a similar operation on an Israeli military expert who is also a friend of mine. Now, in the hour which I have, and I am going to take an hour, so it's going to be the longest lunch you've ever had, I'm going to attempt to cover a subject which is unfortunately rather too broad for the space I have, but I'm going to try and condense it and not get too bogged down in any particular aspect of it. According to the politically correct interpretation of events since 1989, there has been a discontinuity in Soviet strategy. Underlying everything I say will be the following key point. There has not been a true discontinuity. There has only been a Leninist discontinuity. This necessarily entails understanding that everything we see has to be considered either upside down or sideways, which incidentally is an aspect of Satanism, and I'm afraid I have to bring that into this as well later on, although not at any length. The aspects of Soviet strategy I want to consider are as follows. First of all, the period of escalating violence which we have now entered. Secondly, the issue of collective security, which is the Soviet Union's primary objective, the achievement of a collective security system which, of course, Moscow would control. Thirdly, I want to talk about Soviet military preparations. Fourthly, and actually this is really in many respects the most important element, I want to talk about the psycho-offensive, and in particular the promotion of the permissive society. From that, I want to mention briefly the drugs offensive against our societies. I want to talk also about the Gulag briefly, which continues. And finally, I want to talk about the situation in Europe, which is mind-bogglingly terrifying. As a further preparatory point, I just want to point out that the idea that communism disappeared is, of course, one of the key elements of the disinformation. Now, we have specific documentary evidence for the fact that an element of the global strategic deception prepared under Gorbachev and implemented over the change into the apparent non-communist society, was that the selected members of the communist apparatus were given license to adopt false political labels. Now, the documentary evidence for this is to be found in the papers of the 19th CPSU conference in July 1990. There's a speech by Yeltsin in which he says in so many words, "Comrades, the time has now come for those of you who wish to participate in the next stage to choose which political label you would like to wear. Would you like to be a communist? Would you like to be a Stalinist? Would you like to be a free Democrat? Would you like to be a conservative? Would you like to be an agrarian? Take your pick." Gorbachev subsequently confirmed that this was indeed the primary message to be taken away from the 19th Party Congress. Between July 1990 and the miraculous events which took place in August 1991, there suddenly erupted out of nowhere a series of hitherto previously unknown political groupings in the Soviet Union. So what we have seen, in fact, is an exercise in false democracy. All the parties, all the key figures, all the platforms, without a single exception, are controlled. Now, furthermore, we know who's doing the controlling because Political Affairs, which I regard as an extremely important document, the theoretical paper of the Communist Party of the United States, published a statement by an official of the CPUSA who attended a Congress recently, in July 1993, and, 1995. And he made it clear that the CPSU controls all the parties. Now that is a statement, I have the document here. One of the extraordinary things about unravelling this deception and deception strategy is in fact that everything we need, almost without exception, is available in the public domain. If you read the communist press, you'll see what they're driving at. And in this connection, apart from Political Affairs, one of the most important documents is International Affairs, published by the Foreign Ministry of Russia, the Russian Foreign Ministry. This was founded, in fact, by Gromyko. It was founded slightly before Gromyko, but Gromyko was its editor for no less than 30 years. He was succeeded by Andrei Kozyrev, the foreign minister until recently, who in fact is the son of one of the 104, quote, diplomats, unquote, who were dismissed from, who were expelled from the United Kingdom by the Douglas Hume government in 1971. Kozyrev, by the way, is one of the most adept dialectical practitioners. He speaks, as you know, out of both sides of his mouth, and there was that famous occasion in Stockholm where he made two speeches. One speech said, put the Stalinist point of view, and the other speech said the opposite, which was just a game they were playing. And this caused great shock at the time. By the way, when I revealed in a Washington forum what anybody could find out for themselves, namely that these political parties and political groups in the Soviet Union are all controlled, Herb Romerstein, a well-known analyst, interrupted me and said, I suppose you're going to tell us that the CPSU still exists, are you? Well, I was able, luckily, to bring forward the document in question. I don't know why he bothered to say this. I mean, it's available in black and white. We can find it out. We can find everything that I'm about to tell you can be checked in the public domain. There is, however, one thing that I'm going to say which is speculation, and I'll flag that when I come to it. The period of escalating violence. Anybody who has studied the subject knows that that is a familiar phrase. The period of escalating violence is intended to destabilize the enemy at a stage when it is already gravely weakened. Now, who is most prominent in Moscow at the moment? Yeltsin, by the way, has vanished for 2 months. The significance of this I will try to put into context later. Who is the most prominent figure? Our friend Yevgeny Primakov. Primakov, as everybody knows, even those who have failed to take on board the discontinuity, is the king of terrorism. He, in fact, is believed to be the most important terrorist chief in the world. Now, the Israelis discovered a long time ago, many years ago, that the groups which were causing them the most problems were all originally trained either in Soviet locations or by Soviet or East European experts. My wife was telling me yesterday that in the British Sunday press there was a large article on the Iranian terrorist training camps, which apparently are disguised so that they can't be seen from Western satellites. The Iranians are probably the most important surrogates of the Soviet Union. I continue, by the way, to use the phrase Soviet Union because I follow the line of Soviet military intelligence, the GRU, which does not recognize the Vanishing Act, which took place at the end of 1991, which of course was fake. Now, in the context of the period of escalating violence, I have to discuss briefly the TWA crash. First of all, this plane was over waters infested by Soviet submarines. Now, I understand that the Soviet submarines, or the Russian submarines, are in fact normally 200 miles roughly from the coastline. However, if they come in close to the shore, it is impossible, virtually impossible, to detect them. It's much more difficult in shallow water than it is in deeper waters. Now, why would Russia shoot a passenger plane out of the sky with a missile from a submarine? It sounds far-fetched. And that is the speculative element. Of course, I don't know that they did that, but I want to incorporate this in my analysis. They needed to do that on this particular occasion because a controlled operation using a group of terrorists at several stages removed could not be relied upon to achieve the result they wanted specifically at a given time. That plane needed to be shot down and blown up on the date and at the time, or certainly on the date, that the atrocity took place. The reason for this is that a G7 security meeting took place shortly afterwards. Now, I've asked around, because of course it's always possible that one is mistaken in these matters, whether it is possible to organise such a high-profile meeting in Paris within the space of a couple of days, and the answer is no. Of course, it was a pre-planned, a long scheduled meeting. And the principal subject at this meeting was security. Now, the other element to throw into this is that General Lebed, who is now at the very apex of Soviet strategy as the head of the Security Council, made a comment which was monitored, in fact, on National Public Radio at 5 p.m. on the 27th of July, as follows. This bombing shows that international terror is a problem requiring broader coordination in future events. However, Lebed did not comment on the blowing up of a bus in Moscow, and nor, as far as it is known, has he ever commented on any other atrocity, let alone the decimating of the centre of Manchester, which took place some weeks ago. And we don't normally have that sort of comment from a senior, actually the most important Soviet. Why did he intervene? Because they always leave clues. And in fact, it would be much better off saying nothing, because it wouldn't have enabled me to develop this analysis. The reason Lebed opened his mouth is that one of the key objectives of Soviet strategy, in fact they say the highest objective of Soviet strategy, is to establish collective security. And within that, they're looking for a global security system and a series of global networks designed to control the scourge of terrorism, for which they are, of course, largely responsible. The object of the exercise is to raise the level of atrocity in the period of escalating violence, so that finally a call can be made significantly at a G7 meeting, which is where it would be made, for new structures, global structures, designed to preserve humanity from this appalling scourge. Now, why can I say that with confidence? I can say it with confidence because, as always, the strategists reveal what they intend to do. And they did so in a number of articles in International Affairs, which have been published in the last couple of years. In particular, Viktor Yering, who was until quite recently the Interior Minister, wrote an article last year in which he talked about the need for a common, and incidentally common is one of the most important Leninist keywords, parameters for national legislation in order to harmonize as far as possible the approach of countries to the fight against organized crime, and to ensure on this basis, listen carefully if you would to the next few words, the inevitable punishment of persons involved in this activity, irrespective of the place and country where they may have committed their crimes. In other words, what they're driving at is a global justice system and cross-border justice. People can be, criminals could be pursued across borders. This is all about destroying the nation state. If we have global structures, we need the nation state less and less. And underlying Soviet strategy, ever since Lenin, and there's been no discontinuity at all, because while the strategy remains unchanged, tactics change, but the strategy, the overriding strategy remains unchanged, is the destruction of the nation state. Lenin said, we set as our main ultimate objective the destruction of the nation state. So the period of escalating violence serves inter alia the purpose of creating the background noise and the environment for the imposition over and above nations of structures which will disregard national justice systems and will impose a global justice system. That is clearly documented in the Soviet literature. Thank you for your patience. I now want to proceed to the next issue, which is that of collective security. Sergei Rogov, the head of the USA and Canada Institute, or the Institute for the Study of the United States and Canada, made it quite clear in an article published last year that the key objective of Soviet strategy, the highest objective of their policy, he used the word policy, is the creation of a collective security system. Now, that's nothing new. It's been the case ever since the 1920s when the Comintern published its theses. So the creation of a collective security system is what they're driving at. It follows that all collaboration between NATO, which is supposed to be concerned exclusively with the defense of the Western alliance, is an extremely dangerous course for us to follow. And in case this isn't absolutely clear, it was illustrated, you won't be able to see this because it's too far away, but it was illustrated by this quite astonishing photograph which appeared in the European press of Primakov, who is here, shaking the hands of Solana, who is the new chief, NATO chief, and pulling him towards his own podium. In other words, you come along with us. That's what that picture shows. And whether that was done on purpose or not, I don't know, but I find it a most interesting pictorial image of what we're actually facing. Now, the other thing to note about that picture is that Solana is actually, quote, a former communist. Now, in my humble opinion, there are very few former communists around. It's possible to have a change of mind. But once the brain has been impregnated with this stuff, it normally lodges there for the rest of one's life. That the objective is, in fact, the creation of a collective security system was discussed in Soviet Analyst last autumn. And the burden of our message was that the way that the particular dialectic works is that, and we put this in several articles, is that the Soviets would make a big song and dance about, objecting to NATO's expansion. but that at a key moment after the change of government, they would suddenly turn on a sixpence, as we say, and reverse their position. This occurred very recently, and the headline of this particular edition of the Financial Times reads, "NATO growth, no threat, says Lebed." Now I want to point out that the analysis which I have just summarized was published in Soviet Analyst, not due to my brilliance, but due to the fact that International Affairs laid this all out in black and white for everybody who reads it to see. We published this last fall. We therefore correctly predicted, 10 months ahead of the event, 9 months ahead of the event, that the song and dance about NATO expansion was a Soviet disinformation charade. Now the significance of this is not that we got it right, which we did thanks very much to the Foreign Ministry, but the significance of this is that if we can get this right by using such methods, such analytical methods, then it's very likely, or there's a high probability, that other elements of the analysis will be correct. So what the US government, and I shan't give advice to the US government obviously, but what Western governments need to do is to pay much closer attention to what the Soviet strategists say themselves. They are absolutely clear with their objectives. They publish it in an obscure journal, which is actually published, funnily enough, in the United States, in the English language version, in very bad English. They make it clear. I thrive on this because I read this paper and I'm able to take the themes from what they publish, and I'm able to put them into the context of the subject in question and to draw the appropriate conclusions. Now, if I can do that with absolutely no resources, I may say, the British government and the American government can do exactly the same thing. You may have noticed that I didn't pick up a particular document which I needed earlier, because I wanted to read you the definitive statement by Sergei Rogov, the chief of the Institute for the Study of the USA and Canada. And by the way, Sergei Rogov is his KGB code name, and it means the horned one, which in view of what I have to say about Satanism later is, I think, relevant. The definitive statement by Sergei Rogov is that he referred to the comprehensive collective security system which has long been discussed in our country as the highest goal of our foreign and defence policy. Now, it's not the second goal or the 20th goal or the 50th goal, but it is the highest goal of their strategy, to collectivise Western defence, to merge our military power in with theirs, and in so doing to neutralise it. Now, one arena in which is proving extremely fruitful in this respect is that of Europe, and I will switch to Europe in a minute, because in that context we're in the process of collectivising our security and foreign policy strategy, which is a desperate state of affairs. But before I go to that point, you will all know, of course, about the Gorbachev Foundation. The Gorbachev Foundation, last year I described as a new manifestation of the International Department of the CPSU. I would now like formally to correct that analysis. That was a little too hasty. The correct analysis is that the Gorbachev Foundation is what Lenin would have called a new form for the prosecution of the world revolution. It's not what it seems, of course. You're all familiar, no doubt, with some of the extraordinary meetings which took place at last year's State of the World Forum in San Francisco, and there's another one this year at the beginning of October. Well, one of the subjects, in fact the key subject discussed by the Gorbachev Foundation is global security, and they had a long-running series of seminars which went on from 1992 onwards. They started very early, under the heading Global Security Project. Now, we obtained some of the documents of one of the presentations which took place in March 1993. And from the list of attendees at this meeting, one could see that there were GRU officers, KGB officers, American admirals, senior US intelligence officers, and a man, incidentally, called Georgy Shakhnazarov, who runs the Gorbachev Foundation in Moscow. Shakhnazarov is a very senior KGB officer. The subjects discussed under the Global Security Project, which brought forth a document which I have here, were focused on, the threat to humanity, rogue nuclear materials, the danger of nuclear materials and missiles getting into the wrong hands, the need for new structures, the need to collectivize global security. And throughout everything Gorbachev Foundation does is an emphasis on the need for new structures. And what they're driving at, and the purpose of this new form, is to promote, mainly in the United States, which of course is the main enemy, the idea of the redundancy of the nation state and the need for global structures in its place. And they very often don't talk about the redundancy of the nation state because by definition the creation of global structures presupposes the redundancy of the nation state. And that is what, inter alia, the Gorbachev Foundation is all about. Now, General Dan Partin, who is a most wonderful man in Washington, known, I'm sure, to many of you, told me that he found himself in a room for an hour and a half with a senior Soviet naval officer, actually someone who's been a naval officer, an intelligence officer, and the governor of Kamchatka, so he's obviously a senior character who moves around, as they all do, between the interfaces of the structures. Stuck in this room for an hour and a half, General Partin was able to extract from this senior official the following information which he divulged accidentally. He said that the Gorbachev Foundation is in the process of constructing a facility in the Moscow area, 1 kilometer square. And I can only pass on what General Partin told me. I have the name of the admiral in my files. The Gorbachev Foundation is a new form. It's all about pushing past the nation state and grabbing the initiative so that we can abandon the nations we love and find security in these wonderful, all-embracing global structures at every level and on every subject. The Gorbachev Foundation should be banned from the United States. It's a subversive organization. Its object is to influence the elite, which it has done with remarkable success, and its underlying purposes are inimical to the interests of this country. It has branches in the Netherlands, which is highly significant because the Netherlands is more permissive and has gone further down the route to sort of social disorganization than any key European country. There's an outfit in India called the Rajiv Gandhi Foundation, which is an element of this new form. And there are one or two other structures elsewhere, including a curious outfit in Aberdeen called I forget the name of it, but it's rather unimportant, but it's used as a platform for Gorbachev and for Raisa Gorbachev and for others when they come to Britain, which I hope they don't do very often, and I hope they never do again. Raisa Gorbachev, by the way, is a very important person in all this. We know from Dr. Malachi Martin, I have this personally from him in New York, but it's also revealed in his new paper, The Windswept House, which I highly recommend, that Raisa Gorbachev is a student of Antonio Gramsci, one of the authors of the Permissive Society, and I will come to that aspect later. Before I do, I'd just like to mention an event which took place in our lives last week. People come to our door. We have a small building in London, and we do sell publications from the door. So at any time, we normally sell through the mail, of course, but at any time the bell may ring, and indeed this happened, of course, when I was in the United States. I don't know whether that's significant or not. My wife, who runs the office, otherwise it would fall apart, opened the door, and two swarthy gentlemen from, apparently from Turkey, appeared. The older man looked Turkish, and his young companion, aged about 21, was completely silent. The older man asked for a copy of Golitsyn's two works, New Lies for Old, which was published in 1984, although it was actually completed in 1980, and for the new work which I published, and I edited and published last year, The Perestroika Deception. And there are leaflets on this important book in the passage. So my wife went through the simple routine we have, which is to pull out a book, a receipt book, in the process of which one obtains the name, an address, and hopefully the phone number of the purchaser. When it came to asking for his address, he refused to give it. The young man was fretting about parking the car, and he was frightened and concerned. He appeared to be concerned that he was going to get a ticket. So the older of the two told the young man to go out and fix the car, and when he'd left, this man turned to my wife and he said, "I am a KGB officer. I defected X years ago. I won't reveal the number of years here. I provided similar information to that provided by Golitsyn, and nobody in Washington took any notice of me, and I nearly went mad." He then said, "They go by small steps." And he said they were responsible for the TWA crash, that the recent election in Moscow was fraudulent, and that Gorbachev will reappear at the end of the year after a further event. Now, once again, I can only pass on what happened and what we were told. He also, and my wife, we have a stock question which we ask in such circumstances, because there have been one or two others. And my wife said, "Well, what do you think of Oleg Gordievsky, who is a KGB officer, quote, defector, unquote, at large in London?" And he said, "Well, he's one of them." Well, we've actually proved that. That is known to be the case. Oleg Gordievsky, by the way, is an interesting character because he is totally suspended, out of contact. He's got to stay in London, and he's got to continue his role until he dies, or until there's a major shift of tactics. Because if he were to disappear, the entire deception would unravel, because Gordievsky, as you know, is one of the characters credited with having informed Western intelligence that Gorbachev was someone who, as Mrs. Thatcher said, they could do business. Now, he's a most unpleasant man. I've heard him speak. He talks absolute nonsense from beginning to end. He spoke at the Royal Geographical Society last year, and he actually talked about current Soviet operational activities, which is an impossibility if he is a former defector. So they make serious mistakes. And another thing about these characters, if they're false, is that they always write in a certain peculiar KGB type language, and they speak in a certain way as well. But what impressed us about this character is that he wouldn't give his name, which is absolutely correct. He would leave no information. I think he was taking a risk walking into our premises. He doesn't know whether there are any cameras there, which there are not, as it happened. But he decided that he would tell my wife, who I think has a rather honest face. So he decided that he would spill these particular beans. And I'm now making inquiries about the identity of this character. We know how many years ago he defected, and we also know his first name, which I won't reveal here. So I've given some brief outlines of the key objectives of Soviet strategy, and I've spoken en passant about the Gorbachev Foundation, which is a new form for the prosecution of the revolution. Now, there are experts in this audience who know much more about Soviet Russian military preparations than I do. So I won't dwell for very long on this particular subject, but I would like to share with you a number of things which I think are significant. First of all, the Ukrainian émigré community is insistent that there are activities in the Chernobyl area, and they talk about Chernobyl 2 being the site of particle beam weapons research. Now, I've had repeated references to this, and I just pass them on for what they're worth. On the 12th of July this year, the former head of MI6, Baroness Park of Monmouth, who is a very remarkable lady. My goodness, if you put a foot wrong, you get a piece of her mind. She's a very tough cookie indeed. And what they do in Britain is when these people have served their country, they're kicked upstairs to the House of Lords, which I think you should have here really, because it enables the voice to continue to be heard. I mean, you should have a mechanism to enable people after they've served the country to serve in such a forum. Baroness Park made a number of remarks about current Soviet military preparations. And by the way, you will doubtless have observed that most comment on Soviet strategy in the past, or currently, is always couched in the past. Well, I always say, well, is it still happening? In the context of the Gulag, which I will talk about later, that becomes extremely relevant. Baroness Park told the House of Lords, another thing that has not changed is the investment being put into the Russian armed services. By way of another ticking time bomb, they've just started moving radioactive waste from the Pacific Fleet, beginning with 700 fuel elements of nuclear reactors in submarines, from Vladivostok to Chelyabinsk, by train for processing. The Russian Commission has ordered the finance and defense ministers to draw up schedules for reprocessing, as the decommissioned nuclear submarines, quote, pose a danger. Although General Gromov, who now is no longer apparently persona grata, but you must take everything with a pinch of salt, says that the move by train will be absolutely safe. The business of stray nuclear elements is like the Red Mercury story, is all part of an intermittent Soviet intelligence, GRU-controlled operation to maintain an atmosphere of anxiety. It's a bit intermittent, but nevertheless, they come back to this all the time. So anyway, I'm digressing. Although the Russians are concentrating on a leaner, more mobile army, said Baroness Park, they are maintaining and strengthening the strategic nuclear forces and forming new armies in the North Caucasus military district. That is incidentally based at a place called Mozdok, which is the largest military area in the world. And General Grachev boasted in 1993 that this military area had been started since Yeltsin came to power and was designed in such a way that Moscow would be able to wage either regional or global war from that single facility. And this is the area that the former head of MI6 is talking about. They're developing new armies in the North Caucasus military district and in the Kaliningrad special region bordering on the Baltic states. Kaliningrad and Belorussia are armed camps. They have secured bases in Georgia. Well, they don't need to secure bases. I mean, they just demand bases. I don't know why she's not more careful with her English, but anyway. And Armenia. They recently won a revision of the flank restrictions imposed on them by the CFE Treaty, which has given them an extension until 1999 initially, before they need to destroy heavy armaments. Participants in the CFE conference on the treaty reported in June that to begin negotiations on substantially modernizing the treaty and adapting it to a Europe without blocks in the new military political conditions was their aim. Collective security. By the way, the question of the Baroness Park did not cover an issue here which I think should have been covered, which is as follows. That General Grachev and William Perry met, as you may recall, in Kansas last October, where they reached a bilateral agreement which they then sprung on the signatories to the CFE Treaty. And the bilateral agreement was that they would both accept adjustments in the disposition of Soviet military hardware in the various areas covered by the treaty, so that larger amounts of such hardware could be diverted to the Caucasus. Now, that was a cover to enable them to insert this hardware into the Mozdok area. And the Chechnya operation, which serves a number of purposes, serves also the purpose of diverting Western attention from the importance of the Mozdok facility. By the way, on Chechnya, I was on a BBC World Service programme at the beginning of 1995, and as you know, I don't know whether they do this here, but they never tell you who else is going to be on the programme. Well, of course, when I got there, I found that the Izvestia bureau chief was on the programme. So I thought, well, I didn't like the look of him one little bit, and I thought, well, I'm not going to put up with you. What are you going to say? So this fellow said, he said, well, the Chechen problem has to be resolved once and for all. So when I got on, I said, my colleague here has just confirmed what we all thought, namely that the Russians are committing genocide in Chechnya. And I believe that program has quite a wide global audience. But that's not the main purpose of Chechnya. The main purpose of Chechnya is to divert Western attention from what's going on in Mozdok. M-O-S-D-O-K. Continuing briefly, there's not much more, with Baroness Park's remarks, but I want to get to a few things which she has revealed in the public domain, which I want to pass on to you. The Russian long-term armament program, looking at the period up to 2005, envisages more money for the defense scientific and technical base. Yeltsin recently said that military conversion must not affect defense capability. That presumably includes biological weapons programs. Perhaps the most significant development in Russian defense, however, lies in the emphasis on naval nuclear power. As Admiral Patrushev said on the 26th of June, now that the main nuclear potential has been transferred from land to sea after the START I and START II treaties, a Russian nuclear fleet had become a priority and, quote, the new submarines, this is Admiral Patrushev talking, will be quieter, better concealed and equipped with the newest rocket strike capabilities now under development. The Russian Navy, said Baroness Park, will begin receiving its fourth generation of new nuclear submarines in the year 2002. And after 2002, it will receive one new nuclear submarine each year. There is an atomic cruiser now doing its trials, which is due to join the Pacific Fleet in 1997. And apart from a large nuclear-propelled missile cruiser and a large anti-submarine vessel, there will also be several destroyers, multi-purpose nuclear submarines and escort ships. Over the past few years, state-of-the-art technology has been designed for the ships of the future. Admiral Gromov has said that the fleet has about 30% fewer Class 1 and Class 2 ships than the US fleet, yet its potential is greater than that of France, Britain and Germany combined. Finally, and this is relevant to something I'm going to say in the European context, speaking of France, Baroness Park observed, it is worth noting that the French and the Russians have been developing and modernizing the GRAD, G-R-A-D, missile system, developing a new engine, increasing the range from 20 kilometers to 36 kilometers, and improving its precision. Since 1992, the Russian Navy has received 4 nuclear submarine cruisers, 7 multi-purpose nuclear and 2 diesel submarines, 2 destroyers, and 12 other combat ships. Since 1992, when the democratic, peace-loving, kindly, friendly President Yeltsin came to office. Obviously, they need this equipment to combat potential threats from Haiti. Now, I mentioned France in that context because, as I will be able to say shortly, the French are very deeply involved with the Russians. So are the Germans, by the way. But the French have a special relationship with Russia under the terms of their bilateral treaty signed on the 7th of February 1992. So the reference to France's collaboration is significant. Now, British intelligence will not share with the European allies and has resisted all attempts by the European Commission towards the pooling of intelligence. I don't know where this is going to lead because they have to maintain that attitude. They may be collaborating and on stuff which they don't regard to be important. And they may even be supplying some disinformation. Nevertheless, one has got problems about France. The other thing to note is, of course, that the Russians have been supplying their close, quote, allies, actually satraps, with such equipment, including Tehran and Baghdad, without any US sanctions being involved at all. I'm talking about nuclear and missile technologies. It was possible, by the way, as early as 1992 to deduce that this was going on, because a lot of transfer took place during the period of controlled chaos from July 1991 through to early 1992. So that's all I have to say about a subject which you know much more about than I do. Actually, it isn't, because I've missed one of the important points. What would the Russians need to gain from what did they gain from the security meeting which took place in Paris? Why? They gained access to the FBI's files. Because one of the points which was agreed at the Paris meeting was that the security files, the files on terrorism of the G7 plus Russia, would be shared among all parties. So, and this calls to mind another point which the KGB defector said in my office the other day. He said something which is familiar to me, namely that they take small steps. If that was what they achieved as a result of the downing of the TWA plane, and of course that element of the analysis is speculation, then it's a price which they would be quite happy to pay. They couldn't care less. I mean, I'm using hard words about these people because they are still the enemy. Nothing's changed. Now, the most insidious and most disturbing, in a sense, aspect of the offensive against the West is what I call the psycho-offensive. Now, British intelligence, and I'm not in breach of the Official Secrets Act, knows and knew that the permissive society was launched by Soviet intelligence. I've known that for several years. I'm not allowed, for obvious reasons, to go much more into that, except that I can tell you that this information was suppressed under Harold Wilson. I can also give you a further clue. There have been agents in power in key European countries in the last 20 years. No comment about the situation in the United States, of course. Now, it was therefore with great interest that I came across a document giving details of a speech by Lavrentiy Beria, Stalin's NVD chief, interior minister, one of the most evil men ever to have walked this earth. This speech, which has been in circulation for some time, but I haven't seen it, was allegedly addressed to American students at the Lenin School, and they were psychiatric students. And the main burden of this talk was about the perversion of the psychiatric profession. Now, I'm not a doctor, so I've got to be very careful what I say. But what comes out from this document is that so far as the Soviet strategic planners were concerned, psychiatry, the psychiatric profession, was a very fruitful field. Because as this document, which I have here, makes clear, they regard psycho-politicians, as Beria called them, as key instruments of global warfare. And I mean, as you know, when you're describing evil, you end up talking about banality, because that's one of the key features of evil. But the modus operandi, as described by Beria, was to insert indoctrinated psychopoliticians who masquerade as healers, but in fact whose task is to promote the revolution. And they do that, these people are inserted, in the entourage of key figures. And one of them, I regret to say, is Princess Diana in London. She has been under the influence of an undesirable female psychiatrist. I believe it's now been brought to an end, this connection, and it's possible that an intervention which I made through an intermediary may have had something to do with this. An idea of the importance of Beria, who was disposed of after the death of Stalin, and his significance as an author of the Permissive Society can be gained by looking at some of the things he said. Now, I will just read you a few sentences from this document. And the date of the document is 1952. The Permissive Society erupted into the West in the early 60s. Beria is one of the authors of the Permissive Society, but of course the modus operandi, getting inside the minds of the people, is in fact inherent in communism, and it goes right back beyond Lenin. Lenin, incidentally, we now know, or at least I now know, to be precise, attended a satanic event on the island of Capri before he came to power. In Beria's document, or lecture rather, he made the following comments. He said, "Degradation and conquest are companions. In order to be conquered, a nation must be degraded. Degradation can be accomplished insidiously and effectively by consistent and continual defamation. Continual and constant degradation of national leaders, national institutions, national practices and national heroes must be systematically carried out. By attacking the character and morals of man himself, and by bringing about, through a combination of, through contamination of youth, a general degraded feeling, command of the populace is facilitated to a very marked degree. The first thing to be degraded in any nation is the state of man himself, because of course there is no God, so everything's horizontal, man-centered. Nations which have high ethical tone are difficult to conquer. Their loyalties are hard to shake. Their allegiance to their leaders is fanatical, and what they usually call their spiritual integrity cannot be violated by duress. It is not efficient to attack a nation in such a frame of mind. It is the basic purpose of psychopolitics to reduce that state of mind to a point where it can be ordered and enslaved. Thus, the first target is man himself. He must be degraded from a spiritual being to an animalistic reaction. He must no longer think of himself or of his fellows as capable of spiritual endurance or of nobility. The attack on the mind involves changing loyalties. Now, in the British context, they're knocking the monarchy. Now, you have to destroy the monarchy in the United Kingdom before you can destroy the country. The changing of loyalties consists in its primary step of the eradication of existing loyalties. In rearranging loyalties, we must have a command of their values. In the animal, the first loyalty is to himself. This is destroyed by demonstrating errors to him, showing that he does not remember, cannot act, or does not trust himself. The second loyalty is to his family unit, his parents and brothers and sisters. This is destroyed by making a family unit economically non-dependent, by lessening the value of marriage, by making an easiness of divorce, and by raising the children wherever possible by the state. Does that sound familiar? The next loyalty is to his friends and local environment. This is destroyed by lowering his trust and by reportings upon him allegedly by his fellows or the town or village authorities. You've got to see this in the context of 40 years ago. The next is to the state, and this, for the purposes of communism, is the only loyalty which should exist once the state is founded as a communist state. Now, this might sound paradoxical because, of course, they're involved in destroying the state. But the object of the exercise is to establish, as Lenin proclaimed, a world state, a world communist state, which is what is happening under our very eyes through the mechanism of convergence. And the idea of convergence in this context is explained by Anatoly Golitsyn, whose book I edited last year, which you can read for yourselves. By making readily available drugs of various kinds, by giving the teenager alcohol, by praising his wildness, by stimulating him with sex literature and advertising to him or her practices as taught in the sex pol. Now, when I distributed this article or this summary, quite recently someone who wanted to reproduce it said to me, "What is a sex pol?" To which the answer is, as far as I can gather, it was a special institute, which may still exist, which teaches sexual politics. By these means, the psychopolitical operator can create the necessary attitude of chaos, idleness, and worthlessness, into which can then be cast the solution which will give the teenager complete freedom everywhere: communism. By these means, patriotism of youth for their flag can be dulled to a point where they are no longer dangerous as soldiers. While this might require many decades to effect, capitalism's short-term view will never envisage the lengths across which we can plan. May I just repeat this point, because this is a vital confirmation of a central element of the strategy. Beria said, we plan strategy for implementation over prolonged periods of generations or more. And one of the points that I feel strongly about is that the Western pragmatic mind, as educated at Oxford, Cambridge, Yale, and Harvard, is unable or unwilling to think dialectically, to understand the Mongol mentality. Just to conclude these, I think, very revealing remarks by Beria, he added, "We can effectively kill the national pride and patriotism of just one generation, and if we can do that, we've won the entire country." Well, look what happened in the 60s. Therefore, there must be continual propaganda abroad to undermine the loyalty of the citizens in general and the teenager in particular. The role of the psychopolitical operator in this is very strong. He can, from his position as an authority on the mind, advise all manner of destructive measures. He can teach the lack of control of this child at home, which is being done certainly through our education system, and I believe through yours as well. He can instruct in an optimum situation the entire nation in how to handle children, and instruct them so that children given no control, given no real home, can run wildly about with no responsibility for their nation or themselves. This misalignment of the loyalty of youth to a capitalistic nation, he uses the phrase capitalistic because that was the way they spoke. That's the way he thought. But it means us. Sets the proper stage for a realignment of their loyalties with communism, creating a greed for drugs, sexual misbehavior and uncontrolled freedom, and presenting this to them as a benefit will with ease bring about their realignment. Thus, the subject of loyalties and their realignment is in fact the subject of non-armed conquest of an enemy. The educational programs of psychopolitics must, at every hand, seek out the levels of youth. Now this is important as well. Seek out the levels of youth who will become the leaders of the country's future and educate them into the belief of the supremacy of man. This must be made fashionable. They must be taught to frown upon ideas, upon individual endeavour. Now, my contention is that this has happened. We've been through the period of realignment of loyalties, which is why it is so difficult for those of us who can see through this to make our voice heard. And it's particularly difficult in Britain to make, for example, members of the House of Commons understand that they are engaged in a programme which will lead to the destruction of the state. Finally, Beria mentioned religion because, of course, what concerns them most is organised religion, and if I may say so, particularly Christianity. As it seems in foreign nations that the church is the most ennobling influence, each and every branch and activity of every church must, in one way or another, be discredited. Religion must become unfashionable by demonstrating broadly, through psychopolitical indoctrination, that the soul is non-existent and that man is an animal. The lying mechanisms of Christianity, he mentioned Christianity specifically, lead men to foolishly brave deeds by teaching them that there is a life hereafter. The liability of courageous acts while living is thus lessened. Thus there must be no standing belief in the church, and the power of the church must be denied at every hand. Religion must be made synonymous with neurosis and psychosis. And Beria ended by perverting the institutions of a nation and bringing about a general degradation. A population can be brought psychologically to heel. It is, he added, a long and arduous road for the psychopolitical operator to achieve this state of mind on the part of a whole nation. But no more than 20 or 30 years should be necessary in the entire programme, having at hand, as we do, weapons with which to accomplish this task. This speech is dated 1952, and I put it to you that it describes in an elaborate nutshell precisely what has happened to the United States and to Western countries. The Gorbachev Foundation is an instrument for the further promotion of what I call the Gramsci dimension, and I just, for completeness, must bring in the name of Antonio Gramsci, the Italian communist revolutionary who was imprisoned by Mussolini. And in his years in prison, he wrote a notorious work called his Prison Notebooks, which are the Bible of the permissive society. And in this country, the chief torchbearer of Gramsciism in terms of literary output is a man called Carl Boggs. But almost without exception, all those members of the politically correct elite who attended last year's State of the World forum can be considered followers of Antonio Gramsci. And in this connection, I'd just like to add back Malachi Martin's important insight about Raisa Gorbachev being an apostle of Antonio Gramsci. How do we know this? This was revealed to the Pope by Gorbachev himself. And Malachi Martin, as you know, is very close to the Pope. He revealed that information to me last year, but it appears in his new book, The Windswept House, which is all about the threat to the papacy. There's another interesting point about Gorbachev's, and Gorbachev is fascinated by the Pope and by Christianity, which is, of course, he regards as the enemy. Gorbachev spent 13 hours with the Pope, and during that period he asked to see the third Fatima message. Now, I don't want to go into that, except to point out that the third Fatima sister, who remains alive, published details of a vision which are kept in a humidifier in the Vatican. Malachi has seen the contents of this letter, and he said, well, of course, naturally I can't reveal it to you because I'm under oath not to. He said, but I couldn't anyway. So I feel that the Gramsci dimension should be given much higher status in our thinking, because the promotion of permissiveness is being actively followed on a worldwide scale. Who would have thought, for example, a few years ago that Budapest had become the capital of porn? So they're doing it in their own society as well. Now, in terms of where they hope to go from here, the object of the exercise is convergence, which is why when people like me, which doesn't happen very often, stand up on a podium and say the sort of things I'm saying, no one takes any notice. But most of us in this position are inured to that. But we don't go on doing it because we like attention. We do it because we believe it has to be said. In New York, there's a remarkable man who's a friend of mine called Joel Carmichael. He is the editor of Midstream. And in 1990, and I'll conclude on this, he published a book called A History of Russia, in which he described the Mongol mind. And I was particularly struck by the following passage. Joel is a wonderful polymath and a very generous and kind man. Now, when the Mongols were about to launch a military campaign, the Great Council, the Kurile Tai, would convene as a staff headquarters. Operations and targets would be laid down with the captains of all the major army units present to be given their orders. Special agents had already been sent out to spy on the land to be attacked. As much information as possible about the people and the countryside was collected in advance. Appropriate pasturing grounds were reserved along the route to be taken by the troops. This procedure was not a mere matter of information gathering. Secret agents, who were sent out long before the troops were to start marching, carried out systematic propaganda and psychological warfare. The Mongol approach was to persuade the religious minorities that the Mongols tolerated all religions, the poor that the Mongols would be against the rich, and the merchants that the Mongol peace would make the trade routes safe for business. Everyone was promised safety if he surrendered, and frightful vengeance if he did not. The Mongols believed in carrying out their war à outrance. Their goal was the encirclement and physical extirpation of their opponents' armies. The Mongols would envelop a vast area and then tighten the ring around it. The columns operated with astonishing coordination, communication between them being kept up by couriers or smoke signals. If by some chance the enemy was too strong at first for the Mongols to burst through his lines, they would pretend to retreat. As a rule, The enemy would then break ranks and rush forward in hot pursuit, thinking that the Mongols had been routed. The Mongols would then pivot quickly on their agile little horses, reform their ring, and this time finish things off. Now we need to incorporate into our consciousness the Mongol mentality and understand that the discontinuity which apparently took place in 1989 to 81 was a false Leninist discontinuity, the purposes of which were to deceive the West into believing that they had won the Cold War, a boast widely heard here, and to disarm and to let down their defences. We've done everything, and furthermore we were prepared for this by the Gramsci dimension, which has more or less run its course. And the idea of the Gramsci dimension, by the way, is that if people have no loyalties, then they don't care about the future of their countries.